Hello and welcome to Don't Shout at the Telly with me, your host, Sarah Catt. We're delighted to have with us today Dr. Ellie Lee. Ellie is the Director at the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies, and she is also a social policy lecturer at the University of Kent. Ellie will be talking to us about the issue of abortion. Ellie, would you like to start us off?
Yes, and thanks very much for inviting me here today. It's great to be here and have the opportunity to discuss this issue. I think it's very timely. There's been quite a lot of discussion in Parliament which has focused on the issue of abortion services. Certain parliamentarians have been trying very hard to strip services that provide abortion of their counselling role. Following on from that, there was then a lot of media interest, sparked particularly by the Telegraph newspaper, who pursued a sting operation against certain abortion clinics, pursuing accusations that abortion clinics were breaking the law by providing, or at least counselling women about the possibility of them having abortions on the grounds of fetal sex, and that created a phenomenal amount of discussion and high-profile debate. What was interesting about that topic for me was that nobody less than the Secretary of State for Health, Andrew Lansley, then intervened in that discussion and said that he thought maybe something really bad was going wrong with abortion services. And on the back of that, he then got the Quality Care Commission to pursue an investigation of abortion services in general. So we've had all that going on at the kind of political and media level. We've then had a fairly high level of protest from anti-abortion organisations outside clinics. And then, of course, most recently, just this month in September 2012, we've had a woman, Sarah Catt, in prison now for 8 years under the primary law underpinning the regulation of abortion in Britain, which is called the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act. I thought it might be worth at the outset me just setting out for you what my own position is on abortion and its provision. My belief is that abortion should be provided to women under law and in practice as early as possible and as late as necessary. I actually don't think that there should be a law on abortion over and above law which regulates medical procedures in general. So in that sense, my view on legal reform would be that abortion should be decriminalised. That's to say the 1861 Act should be repealed, or at least a section of it which criminalises abortion. So just to bear in mind that in this country, abortion is de facto a criminal offence. It remains regulated under the criminal law, not the civil law. What the 1967 Abortion Act does is to create a defence for doctors who provide abortion against the underlying criminality of abortion. So we presume in this country that abortion is criminal, and both the doctor and the woman can be subject to imprisonment, as we've now seen, unless the terms of the 1967 Abortion Act apply. I fundamentally disagree with that legal position. My reasons for holding this view on abortion fall into two areas, really. The first is pragmatic. So when faced with an unwanted pregnancy, things can go two ways. A woman can have an abortion or a woman can have a baby. There is bound to be an outcome of the pregnancy. It doesn't end in nothing. And you have to ask yourself from a pragmatic point of view, is it better to force that woman to continue the pregnancy and have a baby that she doesn't want and that she doesn't feel that she can raise and that may not be best for her husband, her existing family and so on? Or is it better to enable her to have control over family formation and her reproductive life and live out her life in the way that she sees fit? It may be the case, and probably most of us would think this, that in an ideal world, all pregnancies were planned and all pregnancies were wanted, and all we ever had were planned babies and wanted babies. The truth of it is that real life doesn't work that way. Real life is messy, sex is messy, sexual relationships are messy, and people's relationships are messy. We know that unplanned pregnancy is a fact of life for women, and therefore, of course, for men they have sex with. Sex happens in situations where people don't plan for it, contraception fails, people fail to use it, and accidents just happen, and they happen all the time. It's estimated actually that as many pregnancies are unplanned as are planned. Some of those end in birth, some of them end in abortions, but about 50% it's considered to be the case of all pregnancies are not planned. And you have to ask yourself, well, what is the best way for people who find themselves in that situation to resolve things? I think that pragmatically speaking, people need to be able to resolve that in the best way for them. My other reasons are more, I think, probably philosophical. I've thought about this a lot in terms of how you best as a society organise around a situation where people hold very different views on abortion, because they hold very different views on the question of when they think life begins, or more specifically, when they think life counts or when they think life matters. My view is that a civilised society can allow people to hold whatever views they think, and that nobody should be forced to or have to think something that they don't really think in their hearts or they don't really believe to be true. I don't think that we can ever get to a position where everybody is going to hold the same view on this particular question. I think it's one of those questions where ultimately you can't adjudicate on it through science. Science will never tell us when does life matter. It's not a question which is susceptible to a scientific answer. It's one which people of different religious faiths have different perspectives on, and people of secular views as well have very different positions on. So the conclusion I've drawn from that point of view is that if you accept that we live in a society where there is a range of opinions on this question, then the only consistent, truly liberal view that you could have when it comes to regulation, so say law and policy, is for choice. You have to allow everybody to make their own decisions on this and live out their lives according to what they consider to be their own view on the question of fetal life and when it counts and when it doesn't count. So that leads to me to the view that when it comes to the abortion-seeking woman, she should be able to have the abortion that she wants. It also leads me to the view that to attempt in any sense to force a woman to have an abortion where she doesn't want to is as morally wrong as to deny a woman an abortion when she wants to have one. So for that reason, for example, I'm as resolutely opposed to one-child policies, say in China, or policies which lead to people being compelled to have abortions, as I am opposed to policies which restrict people being able to have them. I think that both are equally morally indefensible from a liberal position which accepts that people have to make up their own mind and live their lives out according to what they consider to be right here. I also hold this view when it comes to the practice of abortion. I think that doctors in this area of the law should be able to practice in line with their conscience. Nobody should be able to be forced to perform an abortion if they consider that against their conscience or against what they believe. Equally, doctors who consider it right to perform abortions, say at very late gestational stages, should be able to do that too. So essentially what I'm arguing here is for a view when it comes to law and policy which is as liberal as possible, which creates as much free rein as possible for people to make their own decisions about this, hold their own view on what they think is right, and then live that out in terms of their views when they're founding their families, when they're having children, but also if they're involved in the provision of abortion services.
You mentioned earlier the Sarah Catt case where a woman terminated her baby in her final phase of pregnancy. As a woman who seems quite adamant about women being able to have abortions as late as necessary, do you ever think there is a line that should be drawn when it comes to a woman conducting an abortion?
The Sarah Catt case, I think that what her case indicates to me more than anything else is the fundamental problem of the way the abortion law works. My understanding of her situation was that she hid her pregnancy or wasn't aware of her pregnancy until pretty late into it. So she was well after 20 weeks before she even sought any type of medical assessment or medical care. And she did present at an abortion service after the cut-off point for legal abortion. So the legal cut-off point for abortion is called 24 weeks. Strictly speaking, it's 23 weeks and 6 days as assessed by ultrasonography. I think that it would have been preferable for her case to have been managed by an abortion service, for the abortion service to be able to assist her at 27 or 28 weeks. To end up doing what she did, she must have been really desperate not to have this child. That's awful. Nobody would want to be in her shoes and be in her situation. My case would be that it would be better for an abortion service to have been able to have helped her earlier. The decision to send her to prison for 8 years seems to me to be utterly beyond the pale in terms of what any reasonable person would do to somebody, thinking about the consequences for her and her family. So in sum, for me, this is a cast iron argument for the decriminalisation of abortion. That's my view on it.
I'd love you to elaborate on what you mean by it being wrong that she's been sent to jail for 8 years. I mean, essentially, it was fully cooked. It was about to come out. It was near its arrival into the world. I think when you do things like that, you open yourself up to what we call earthly justice, and earthly justice says she got 8 years. I don't see how that's wrong.
It seems like they don't seem to take into account her full situation, because for her to go to such an extent, to go on the internet to take drugs without really any health medical advice, surely there's something deeper than just her simply wanting an abortion. But I feel like the judge must have had his own moral opinion, and it kind of overlooked the situation.
If they had permitted her to have an abortion beforehand, she wouldn't have ended up in prison, because she would have had an abortion a lot before. So that seems like it's not her fault. It seems like it's more like, like a systematic thing, and that really annoys me, because that means that she's paying for that systematic problem.
I just wanted to ask, who chooses the cutoff point? Because it's like, if an abortion is an abortion, either you have an abortion or you don't have an abortion. Unless there's an increased risk at a later stage, I don't see why there's a cutoff point. And if there is an increased risk, why can't we put in practice methods of decreasing that risk?
I think cutoff points are really important, because an abortion is effectively the ending of life, right? Even though we may be comfortable with the fact that it is not a fully human life, it is still there. You could still have a beating heart, for example. We have to really try and figure out where our line between what is human life and what is not human life, where that line is. Because I think just to say, as soon as it just comes out of the womb and is then in the world, that seems like a very arbitrary point to decide that's when human life begins. And if we have laws against homicide, those are there to protect human life. If abortion is legal, it means that whenever abortion applies, that life is not human. And I'm just I'd kind of like to ask you, Ellie, why your point at which life becomes human is the arbitrary point at which the baby is born, and not at some point before that or some point after that.
I have a cousin who was born prematurely at 25 weeks and obviously put in an incubator and survived. And obviously that's quite a while before 39 weeks, and it seems that for me at least, the cut-off point for the abortion one seems about right as to when the baby is actually, or the fetus actually turns to a baby and becomes a human being in its own right.
I don't think abortion is that question. Abortion is about unwanted pregnancies, about people who don't want those pregnancies and want to terminate them. But on the point of the arbitrariness of the cut-off line, I actually think that putting the cut-off line in terms of abortion to, when the child is born, it's society's problem, or that society can have some say about what happens after that, I think that's the least arbitrary point in terms of abortion. I actually think 24 weeks is quite arbitrary, because if I did it at 24 weeks and one day, I'd be a murderer. You're basically saying that as a woman, you're telling me that I'm born this way, that I'm born with the ability to carry life inside me, and therefore I do not have the same rights and the same control over my fertility as a man would. And that's essentially what someone is saying to me, and I can't do anything about that.
If I could just respond, I don't think that 24 weeks is any less arbitrary than the point of birth. I was just trying to bring in the fact that the point of birth is also arbitrary. If we're going to pick an arbitrary point, and we're taking the autonomy and the right of the woman to control her own life as the ultimate sort of value in this debate, which I do agree with. Why does it not logically follow then that if a woman has a baby and then decides at that point that she doesn't want it, why then is infanticide a problem?
I think the law itself is not reasonable. The consequence is the same. So for the case, the lady was put into prison. I think the law, the judge has abused the public authority. The law in UK is for the good life of citizens. So if put the lady in the prison for so long time, her family was completely ruined by the law. Her family is going to be destroyed.
I consider legal abortion and the availability of abortion for women to be one of the most fundamentally civilising aspects of society and its advance. If you look at societies where there isn't legal abortion, and indeed if you read or come to understand what things were like in this country before the 1967 Abortion Act, separate to its flaws, which I think are many, things were fundamentally less civilised. One thing that happens if you don't have legal abortion is infanticide. So if you're concerned about infanticide, you have to ask yourself, why would somebody kill their child? Why would somebody kill a newborn baby? Women don't do this because they're evil people who want to kill newborn babies. Infanticide happens for reasons to do with people working out how they're going to manage their resources, organise their families and so on and so forth. And one of the things which systematically has reduced the incidence of infanticide in civilised societies is legal abortion. For me, it's one of the cast iron arguments as to why you have to have it. There's an aspect of the provision of abortion, both women seeking it and people providing it, which self-regulates. People don't want to have really late abortions. Nobody sets out when they have sex with somebody to think, oh, I'm going to do this, and then what I really, really want to happen is to have a 28-week abortion. That's what nobody does. And if you look at what happens in the real world, people try and sort these things out as quickly as possible, and people who want to be able to provide abortions to women try and help them as quickly as they possibly can. If you have to have a legal framework around this, I think that birth is it's as logical as you can get. The reason for it is that at the point of birth you have two separate individuals, so there is no longer any question of a conflict between protecting the life of one and protecting the life of the other. They're independent, separate beings. Before that, to save the fetus, you have to interfere with the life of the woman. There's no getting around it because it's being carried by her. So there is an infringement of her moral autonomy. And for me, that's why it is the most logical position to have. That doesn't mean women are going to have abortions at 37, 38 weeks. They have them as early as possible. They really do.
Instead of naming and shaming women who have abortions, should we not be focusing on preventing unwanted pregnancies from happening in the first place? I'm in my last year of secondary education, and I can only remember one sex education lesson. Should we not be putting more emphasis on sex education within schools? Because within Britain we do have the highest rate of teenage pregnancy. Is that not where the problem lies within the classroom?
I do agree with you, because I actually think that too many people just don't think about it before they do it, and it's just so irresponsible. We have to educate people to be more responsible, to be more aware of what they're doing.
I think when discussing whether it's right or wrong, you have to understand what life would be like without abortion. Going back on the Sarah Catt case, where it was quite an extreme and extraordinary situation that most people don't really want to hear about, whereas if you were to take away the safe medical practice of abortion, a lot more of these situations would arise, like abortions happening in alleyways and things like that, unsafe practices. So for that reason, I do think that we have to understand that abortion isn't necessarily an evil practice, but instead a method of preventing evil actions from occurring.
I don't think abortion is going to get any less of an issue. I think it's going to remain quite controversial. But what I do want to know is what kind of resolution we can have, and that's really what I wanted to ask you, Ellie, as well, is whether there's any way that people can express their views, whether they don't feel that abortion is right or not, but at the same time not infringe the rights of the woman who's chosen to have abortion.
I just wanted to ask about, sort of in terms of education, what do we think about things like, my girlfriend went to a Catholic school and they showed her a video of an abortion in an RE lesson. I mean, what do we think about things like that and sort of putting children off things like this and sort of making them look awful.
Could I just add to your point about showing images of an abortion? Now, in some instances, anti-choice protesters use these images outside abortion clinics, but and yes, okay, freedom of speech, but do you feel that this is not excessive?
But I do think it gets to a point where such images, they become useless, because personally I went to a Catholic school as well, and we're constantly showing videos and images of abortion, and I have to say I've become quite desensitised towards it. Once you've seen one aborted fetus, you've pretty much seen them all. Are there not better ways of encouraging people to not have abortions?
I basically fundamentally disagree with the whole prevention line and the whole idea that you can kind of educate out the need for abortion. And indeed, I have spent a lot of time in recent years arguing specifically against the focus when it comes to discussions about abortion and policymakers' interests on this complete preoccupation with teenagers. If you look at the reality of abortion-seeking women, most abortion-seeking women are not teenagers. About 40% of women who have abortions are mothers, so they've already got children. The population groups where there's the highest incidence of abortion, taking into account the proportion of people of said age in the population, are women in their 20s, women in their late 20s, and there is a very significant demand for abortion from women in their 30s. Teenagers constitute overall a real minority of the abortion-seeking population. My view on the situation overall is that far from seeing the present demand for abortion as being symptomatic of sexual irresponsibility, what I'm actually surprised about is that the demand for abortion is not higher. Now, people always find this rather counterintuitive and rather odd, because we're constantly surrounded by a discussion of the idea that there's this phenomenal rate of abortion, that there's more and more teenage pregnancies and so on. If you actually take a step back and you look at the statistics, nothing could be further from the truth. Most women actually never seek an abortion. About a third of women will do, so that's the truth of it. If you think about people's lives, most of us become sexually active when we're around 15 or 16, and most women lose the capacity to become pregnant at all sometime in their late 40s. So if you think about any of our lives, given the fact that probably most of us have an expectation that during that period of time we'll at least be having some sex, we have got a lot of years in our life when we are sexually active and face the possibility of getting pregnant. In that situation, the fact that most people have babies, some people have 1 or 2 abortions, I see as completely understandable, completely normal, completely acceptable, and I simply do not see it as a cause for concern. I don't think we need to have measures which present this as some kind of major deficit behaviourally in the way we think about sex in relation to our responsibility in regards to other people. I simply see it as a fact of life. If we accept that we want to have sex for fun, that we want to have it more than 2 or 3 times in our lives, which is the amount of time that most of us will seek to have children, then we have to accept that unwanted, unplanned pregnancies will happen. And they happen to completely responsible, fine, upstanding citizens all the time, all over the place. And I honestly don't think that it makes any sense to try and argue that you need, tons and tons of sex education to address it or something like that. And I just don't think there is anything about this actually that needs fixing in relation to the basic fact that in our society people get pregnant, things happen and they don't want to be anymore. What I do think is that we need to have a society that accepts that and enables people to address that problem for them in their lives in a way which is as safe, easy and acceptable as possible. That's my view on it. The government is very keen to tell us all that we should think much more carefully before we have sex, be very, very careful about it, be worried all the time about the outcomes. I think this is an unwarranted level of government oversight of people's private lives. And I think that the consequence of them viewing sex like this is to encourage a really negative view of abortion. Basically, the way they see abortion is as a really dreadful outcome of a really dreadful thing that people do, which is to have sex without planning it like a military operation. I think that is a really bad way to think about human relationships and something which is completely life-affirming. You know, sex is a good thing. It's an important part of people's lives, and if accidents happen as a result of it, we need to be able to have ways of managing it.
Well, basically, for a starter, I do agree with you. I mean, life is a mess. And it's true that the government, you know, sort of, it seems like they're trying to control all that and trying to make everything sort of, you know, utopical. But life is a mess. And if you don't allow, you know, if you don't get society out of the taboo of abortion, then it's going to be even messier and even worse, because those women that end up being convinced not to do an abortion and have babies that they didn't want to have, they end up being sort of, I'm not going to say a burden, but it's complicated for society to absorb single mothers that are not going to be able to get a job and everything, that they're going to have to end up living off benefits or something like that. And I think that's more of a problem than, you know, that's more of a problem for the government and for the people living in this country than those women having an abortion.
It seems like, to an extent, you can't really win, because if you don't want to be in a position where you become a single mother and you don't have the finances, you feel to look after a kid, so you decide to have an abortion, for example, you're seen in a negative light. But then you feel to yourself, okay, I don't want to have an abortion because it looks bad, I might be seen as this, I might be seen as that. So you go through with it, you end up having a child, you end up being that single mum, struggling, you still get seen in a bad light.
Do you think it's useful to keep the sort of discourse political and talk about it in terms of women's rights and things like that, because it makes sure it's sort of fair and prescient and whatever, or do you think it needs to be made more a personal choice? And you've sort of talked about abortion in terms of a treatment. Do you think that's helpful? Which sort of way of looking at it do you think is better for women themselves?
On your point, there's a long and I think extremely problematic history which is attached primarily to advocacy of contraception but has also become tied up with abortion, of seeing these things as public policy tools to manage populations, and in particular to manage what some sectors of society consider to be problematic sectors of society who would prefer it if they didn't have children. I have spent a lot of time making it very clear that my position is utterly antithetical towards that. You know, you don't use the word lightly, but that tradition is called either the eugenic tradition or the Malthusian tradition. As it happens, one of the early pioneers of birth control, Marie Stopes, she was both a eugenicist but also an advocate of what she called married love, in other words, sex for pleasure within marriage. I just don't agree that that's what abortion should be there to do. I think that we have to have in a civilised society a zone of privacy, a zone of proper private life within which we consider it the case that people make their own decisions about founding their families and building their families. So my position on the reasons why I think abortion should be available is because it enables an expansion of the zone of privacy, an expansion of moral autonomy, not because I think it's a good way of stopping poor people from having children, because they'll become a burden on society. I'm entirely opposed to that point of view.
I do agree with you when you say that the decision about abortion is the woman solely, alone. I strongly believe it's true. But I was wondering if you believe that the man, the father, has the right to decide about this too. What is his role?
I don't think that men should be given in law any rights. Neither do I think anybody else should. As it happens, I would include doctors in that, which is one of the reasons why I disagree with the 1967 Abortion Act, even though it has legalised abortion and, you know, relatively speaking, it's better than before the 1967 Act. I don't think grandmothers, cousins, next door neighbours or anybody else should be given legal authority to interfere in the decision-making process of a woman in relation to her pregnancy. My belief is that the decision ultimately about whether to continue a pregnancy or end it has to rest with the woman and woman alone. The decision on whether to perform that abortion rests with a doctor. Rights are different to interests, and I think men have interests in the outcomes of pregnancy. The way that reflects itself in real life is that the vast majority of decisions about whether to continue or end a pregnancy, most estimations put it at around 90%, are jointly made.
I heard recently that there's a movement to introduce more counselling for women who are thinking of having an abortion. And from what I read about it, it seemed like there was opposition to this on the basis that it was basically saying that women are not capable of making that decision alone. It's too big a decision, therefore they need that additional counselling. I found that a bit surprising, just purely because if the counselling stuff is delivered by someone who hasn't got an agenda either way, I would have thought that counselling is just generally a beneficial thing to have, and we probably should have more of it in all areas, not just over the question of abortion. But I did wonder why there was this opposition to it on that basis.
There have been some vigilantes that have been outside the abortion clinics. Some of them say they have been quietly and peacefully handing out leaflets and protesting. But don't you think that even though they are showing their freedom of speech, could you say that perhaps they're encroaching another, the woman's freedom of speech? Don't you think there's a blurry line? Perhaps they've crossed it. What's your opinion on that?
You know, I wouldn't call on the law to say they can't stand outside an abortion clinic. At the same time, you know, a lot of pro-life protesters have been hiding behind this sort of free speech thing, and therefore saying, you know, we should be allowed to be there, and clinics can't tell us to go away. I'd say, well, clinics can tell you to go away. And I also think the fact that they're standing outside abortion clinics trying to get individual women and trying to persuade these women not to go through with the abortion is to me, shows that they don't want to have necessarily a big public debate on the issue itself, and, you know, sort of just target individual women going in there, which I think is a problem.
Also, I mean, it extends as far as various counselling services are putting on a front to act as counsellors for those wishing to abort, but really what they're trying to do is to deter them from going through the abortion process, and I personally see that as a breach of that woman's rights. How is this allowed to be so prominent in society? I know there's this talk of an Americanization in society, where a lot of facets taken from American society and have you know, a lot of the tactics used over there. But why is that still going on over here?
I think it's true to say that in general there has been what you could call an Americanisation of the approaches of the anti-choice movement. By that I mean that if you look at the history of the way things have proceeded with how those opposed to abortion make their case and campaign, quite a long time ago there was a very deliberate strategy adopted by people who oppose abortion in America to pretty much give up making the case against abortion on moral grounds and trying to change the law which regulates things in the States, which was a Supreme Court ruling from 1973 called Roe v. Wade, and instead to adopt a whole other sorts of lines of arguments which, broadly speaking, are packaged around the idea of presenting the anti-abortion movement as pro-woman. So this has involved them articulating various arguments about the health risks of abortion, saying they want to help women by giving them counselling, that they're on the side of women, they're trying to save women as well as the fetus, and so on and so forth. And I think it's definitively the case that people of that way of thinking in this country have adopted those lines of argument. So you see that expressing itself in the efforts to say that no, we want to give better counselling to women. That's an argument made by people who oppose abortion, and them standing outside clinics praying or giving out leaflets about mental health risks and so on. So that has happened. By and large, I would say that therefore their politics and their approach is pretty degenerate, it's pretty low. And I think that what we see outside the clinics is a manifestation of that kind of low level of engagement with the issue. Do they have a right to stand outside clinics and do that? I would say yes. It's a public place and they have a right to express their opinions. My position on it would be, I think that it's extremely bad faith for them to exercise that right. So they have the right, but I think that they should, if they had better faith, they would not exercise it and they would do something else. I find myself as opposed to some of the reactions of the pro-choice movement to these protests as to the protests themselves, though. I think seeking to use public order legislation to prevent these protests is as problematic as the protests themselves.
I do strongly believe that nobody should prevent women from entering an abortion clinic, because at the end, it's their own decision. It's just about them.
I think the state should have a minimal sort of interaction with women's own personal health decisions. I think to make it completely unregulated and say that the society an individual lives in has no sort of say over the behavior of that individual, whatever it may be, I think that might be jumping too far, and I think we need to kind of merge the views of society combined with what is best for the individual.
I'm pro-choice because, in spite of everything that's been said to say, you have to take into account that yes, life is messy, you can't predict everything, you have to take circumstances into account, so I feel you always have to have something there as a fail-safe.
For Sarah Catt's case, we just mentioned before, I listened to the radio. There was a female soldier gave birth in Afghanistan before her departure back to UK. She didn't know she was pregnant. So I think in Sarah Catt case, she had a scan in 30 weeks. She could be hasn't realized that she's pregnant. So I think the judge should give some kind of consideration for her case. So I support her should not be put into the jail.
I'd just like to make clear that I think that abortion is a completely personal decision for a woman to make for herself, and I want to know when it will sort of stop, but when it will stop being an issue for so many people to talk about and sort of the public debate, and it will just become sort of a non-issue.
Yeah, I think overall abortion should be a personal choice for a woman, because it shouldn't be a political issue, because if the government is interfering into a woman's life, it's taking her right to her own body and it's a violation.
I think there should be a cut-off point as to when a woman is allowed an abortion. I agree with the free speech of the pro-lifers, but I cannot, by any means of my conscience, justify their decisions to be doing the things they're doing outside abortion clinics.
Personally, I'm pro-choice because at the end of the day, no one can actually say what the woman's going through. You can regulate as much as you want, you can generalise as much as you want, but each woman is an individual woman. Like, women are not just one category that all fit the same mindset. They've all had their own situations, their own perceptions of that situation. So a rule that covers them all, it just won't, in this sense, it just won't stick. It's just not fair. And also I feel that the idea of freedom of speech, even though it's a necessity in society and it's a great thing, it is an excuse, as Sal said. Some people use it as an excuse to just, like, certain things, you have the right to say it, but sometimes it's just bad manners, bad faith. So it's about the here, the when and where.
I think the main question should not be when does life begin, but about the individual saying, will I be a good mother and can I provide and do I actually want this child? And in that perspective, I'm not pro-life or pro-choice. I think it just depends on those three questions that the mother needs to ask herself.
I think to oppose medical practices that abort unborn babies is prioritising keeping a pristine image of life in pregnancy rather than dealing with the true grittiness that is real life.
Well, I've really enjoyed the discussion, and again, thanks very much for letting me take part in this. I suppose, overall, I think that the most important question for anybody to try and work out, if there's somebody who thinks it's important to have a liberal society and to have a society which is civilised, is how do we manage the fact that different people, different groups of people, and even individuals at different points in their lives place a different value on fetal life. So life begins at conception, biological life clearly begins at conception. What value we place on fetal life is a question of an entirely different order. At what point we think it matters is about a different set of issues altogether. The conclusion I've reached myself is that a liberal society would make the answer to that question as subjective as possible. That's to say, it's a question which comes down to individuals, which they have to work out in accordance with particular circumstances in their lives and their wider value systems. So the answer to that question will be different depending on what values you hold more generally, but it will also vary for individuals according to their circumstances in their lives. And I think this is a point that's really missed all the time in debates about abortion, that an individual woman can at a particular point in time know for absolute certain that abortion must be the choice for her. She can be absolutely clear without any shadow of a doubt that to continue a particular pregnancy is 100% not what she wants to do. That same woman at another particular point in her life can value a different pregnancy more than she values her own life. And this happens to women all of the time. You know, women who have abortions also have babies. And when they're pregnant with the pregnancy that's wanted, nothing matters to them more than the life of that pregnancy. They value the first time they feel the child move, obviously. They're very interested in the scan, more interested than any other picture they've ever seen in their whole life. But that same woman can also, in a different circumstance, know for sure that a pregnancy should end. And I personally think that a civilised society should enable people to live life that way, to be able to measure things up and make decisions according to what they consider to be right in particular circumstances, in line with the particularities of their lives and the particularities of their wider value systems. And that also holds for people who are religious. You know, lots and lots of Catholic women have abortions because particular circumstances in their lives determine that. And I think that, you know, to have a society that can move forward, we need to have a recognition that ultimately that question, when does life matter, what value do we give it when it's fetal life, is something which has to be left up to individuals to decide upon. People can have different opinions on it, they can have different views on it at different particular points in their own life, but we need to then have a system of law and policy which gives as much sway as possible to that variation in views and opinions. And then everybody can live out their lives and have their own opinions as they see fit. But nobody should compel other people to live out this area of life in a way that they don't consider to be appropriate for them.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you, Ellie, so much for a really thought-provoking discussion. We'd love to hear your comments, and if you'd like to get involved in Don't Shout at the Telly, email us.